In the 1960s, the jet age literally took off. Well, it actually started in the 1950s, which is when the first jet-powered aircraft actually flew. But throughout the late 50s and the 1960s, the rest of the world very quickly caught on to the jet age, and New Zealand was no exception to this. In the 1960s, New Zealand actually had two national airlines. Yes, two. But what were they? Well, the first of these was of course the Air New Zealand that we know and love today, but it wasn't always called Air New Zealand. It actually started in 1940 as Tasman Empire Airways Limited, or TEAL for short, and it was a joint venture between Australia and New Zealand to operate trans-Tasman flights. And then in 1965, the airline became wholly owned by New Zealand, by the government, and was renamed Air New Zealand, and became responsible for all of New Zealand's international flights, and took delivery of its first jet-powered aircraft in 1965, which was the Douglas DC-8. But what about that second airline? What was that? Well, that airline was NAC, or the National Airways Corporation. The National Airways Corporation was formed in 1947, just after the Second World War, and it was mainly a combination of an old Royal New Zealand Air Force squadron and several other small aircraft operators around the country. And NAC, as they were known, were responsible for domestic flights all around New Zealand, and later some flights out to the Pacific Islands as well. In the mid-1960s, NAC's fleet consisted mainly of turboprop-powered aircraft, mainly the Vickers Viscount, of which deliveries had begun in 1959, and the Fokker F-27 Friendship, which was a Dutch-built aircraft, of which deliveries began in 1960 and carried through to 61 and 62, mainly replacing the old Douglas DC-3s. However, as early as 1959, NAC expressed interest in operating a jet-powered airliner, and they actually hired a de Havilland Comet in 1963 whilst they were toying with the idea of jet-powered aircraft. But here's the catch. The Comet was in the same class of aircraft as the Boeing 707 and the Douglas DC-8, aircraft that were just simply too big for the kind of services that NAC wanted to operate jets on, so they needed to find something smaller. In the end, they drew up a list of 3 aircraft that they felt could be the right one for them, 2 American and 1 British. The American offerings were both planes that you're probably quite familiar with, the ever-popular Boeing 737 and the Douglas DC-9. The British offering, though, was a plane that you probably may not have heard of, especially if you're quite young, the BAC-111. The BAC-111 is an especially rare aircraft, particularly these days, as most of them were withdrawn in the 1990s due to European noise restrictions on jets. Now, and the other reason why they're quite rare is simply because so few of them were built. Only 244 111s were ever built between 1965 and the late 1980s, whereas over 900 Douglas DC-9s were built, and over 10,000 737s have been built since the 1960s, because let's not forget that modern versions of the 737 are still being produced to this very day. Now, NAC had shortlisted the Boeing 737 as the best fit for its operations in New Zealand, but there was a problem. As with so many things throughout history, the government started to get in the way. In the 1960s, New Zealand was under a national government, led by this man, Keith Holyoake. Keith Holyoake had actually come to power in 1957 after the National Party's previous leader and Prime Minister Sid Holland had stepped down due to ill health, having brought the National Party into power for the first time in 1949. After a brief spell under a Labour government from 1957 to 1960 led by Walter Nash, Keith Holyoake led the National Party back to power again in 1960, and he led the party right up until 1972 when he stepped down. Now, this national government was a particularly pro-British government right throughout the Sid Holland era and the Holyoake era, and they were not happy with NAC, an airline that, don't forget, they still owned, purchasing American-built planes. The problem was this: It was actually the government that led to the purchase of the Fokker F-27 Friendship in the late 50s in the first place. A British company called Hanley was producing a new plane called the Page Herald. But this plane was a new aircraft and didn't have any kind of track record. But the British government was pushing New Zealand to purchase this new aircraft, mainly reminding the country that it was still a British colony, and it still is to this day, and that it should respect that and buy more British products. But the government wasn't happy with that, and they pushed NAC to buy the Dutch-built Fokkers instead because they had a proven track record. It was because of this pro-British attitude of the national government that when the NAC management went to the government asking for funding to buy some Boeing 737s, they promptly turned them down and told NAC management to go and do their sums again, which in my mind suggests that they were basically telling NAC to do the maths basically as many different ways as it was possible until they came up with an answer that the government liked. Despite this, NAC remained confident in Boeing, so confident in fact that the manufacturer was able to secure early delivery slots for NAC. And NAC continued to rebuff the government and eventually won over the government with simple economics. The job of 4 BACs could be done using just 3 Boeing 737s. The plane was just simply that much more efficient. And so in 1966, the government eventually gave up and decided to approve funding for the purchase of 3 Boeing 737s. But just imagine though what would have happened if NAC had lost to the government and had purchased the BAC 111 instead. New Zealand's aviation history could have been so much different. I mean, NAC and Air New Zealand were merged together into just Air New Zealand in the 1970s. But if NAC had been operating the BAC instead of the 737, then things could have been a lot different. Let's not forget also that in the late 60s and early 70s, NAC did consider purchasing the Boeing 727 trijet. And if NAC had been operating the BAC 111, would they have considered purchasing this other type of Boeing jet? It's possible that they might not have. I mean, in the end, NAC never purchased the 727 due to economic issues and other financial concerns that meant it was no longer affordable for them to invest in the 727. But think about it. After the merger between NAC and Air New Zealand, would Air New Zealand have continued down the course it did and bought this Boeing 737-300, the updated version? Maybe, but maybe they wouldn't have. Let's not forget Air New Zealand's long history of buying American aircraft, especially Boeings. I mean, they've operated, as well as the DC-8 and the DC-10, they've operated 2 versions of the 747, the 737, the 767, the 777 and the 787, the last 2 of which they still operate to this very day. The only non-Boeing jets that is, that Air New Zealand operates are the Airbus A320s, which it now operates in place of the Boeing 737. Although this could change though if Air New Zealand does eventually choose to buy the Airbus A350, which is always a possibility. But I always think it's worth thinking about, you know. Sure, the actual conflict with the government there over which aircraft to buy was a relatively minor issue in New Zealand's history, which is why outside of aviation enthusiasm it's largely gone unforgotten. But just think about how different our air industry could have been. I mean, Air New Zealand may have never operated the Boeing 737 if that had happened. Let's also not forget that the BAC was a rear-mounted engine jet like the DC-9 and not a wing-mounted engine aircraft like the 737. If they had opted for the BAC, then when the time came to upgrade their fleet, Air New Zealand may have chosen to go for another rear-mounted engine aircraft, such as the MD-80 family or the Boeing 717, for example, and not the 737. Ultimately, we'll never know, because NAC did win over the government and they did purchase the Boeing 737. But it's just interesting to think about how different our air industry might have been if things had gone the other way. And not to mention that it's just a really good example of a corporation sticking it to the government and doing their own thing anyway. And let's face it, who doesn't love a story of a corporation not doing what the government told them? Thank you so much for watching, guys. I hope that you enjoyed this video as much as I've enjoyed making it. I'm going to be making videos on all sorts of different topics, so if this video wasn't quite your cup of tea, don't worry. Hopefully my next video will be. So make sure that you click on the subscribe button if you haven't already to get my next video first when it comes out, which will be whenever that is. I have all sorts of ideas to make for making new videos, and I'll get those done as soon as I can. So yeah, I'll see you guys in the next video.